Hello, welcome to episode 5 of the dystopian novel They Said There Was, and we're on chapter 17. It was a lot quieter in the office these days. The long queues outside were gone, which was in sharp contrast to elsewhere, where the shops that were still open, those selling food, had long queues outside them. He passed these in the mornings, anxious to get to his desk, hoping everyone else would be as late, since traffic was usually delayed by spot police checks designed to catch out anyone who was thinking about breaking the travel distance rules and send them back home after their details were taken and a warning given, with an educational lecture before they left. He'd witnessed a few of these already when the traffic was stopped, and had even seen some brazen types arguing with police, even as the police were trying to educate them about the danger they posed by travelling out of their zone. More staff had disappeared, but not through being held up in the mornings. No, they had obviously caught the infection and been taken to hospital. Some might be dead by now. He heard no one talk about them, but since there was no mixing and break room was strictly one person at a time, there was bound to be no discussion. Death wasn't something you talked about anyway, and was better discussed neutrally as a statistic if it had to be mentioned. The pandemic unfortunately introduced the topic as a necessity to focus on for survival. He had fewer files to put away and more time to fill in, so he took the work slowly, often shuffling papers around on his desk to look busy. He would have liked to read news articles while in work to alleviate the boredom, but even if staff had had access to the web, from which their computers were blocked, except from government sites they had to coordinate with for uploading files, he wouldn't have wanted to risk other employees seeing him idle. The days felt longer than they had before. He almost looked forward to going home in the evenings, even if he didn't know what Deirdre would be up to when he got home. She'd taken to the internet a lot herself these days with the course she was doing. Something about computers for her school, for the children, she said. Why she needed all the books just to mind children for a few hours was beyond him, but she said they were thinking of introducing a home school system for children for a while, in case the injections took a few weeks more. The Educational Government Department wanted teachers to prepare for this possibility, in case they had to move teaching to an online environment quickly, apparently. It gave her something to do that kept her quiet, but the work table became the usual mess, just with books and computer instead of craft or art things on it, piling up. He stood at the table, looking over it, out the window, thoughtfully. The children, he realised, did need discipline, so this was good having to be at school, but online, if it kept them off the streets altogether. In fact, he could see 3 children walking past on the street, and only one of them was wearing a mask. It was appalling that irresponsible parents weren't keeping them in, like the old people. And where was that old person going, he thought, as he saw one walking oh so slowly by. They're all supposed to be staying in, and he looks at least 70 years old, that one. He hoped someone would recognize him and ring the free phone line to tell the authorities where he lived so the police could be sent around to give him a warning at least and an educational talk. It might be an idea to stay on the watch for people breaking the rules, since he was part of a big team effort to fight the disease and get things back on track to the old normal days again. He saw a woman walking by with no mask on, carrying something big, a bundle of logs under her arm, out of which several were spilling onto the ground. What was she at? Why would anyone be carrying logs in the street and with no mask on? Surely they came in bags, like the ones he'd seen beside the fertilizer bags he'd put into his wife's trolley when she nagged him to help her get her gardening things a few times. She didn't seem old enough to be safe nesting, he thought, pulling the curtain aside very slightly to peer through. But there was no explanation for her odd behaviour. And unsafe at that. He thought of the phone in his pocket with the new apps that had self-installed when he registered himself and his wife's details, but had never seen the woman before, so couldn't report the infringement if he wanted to. He didn't know many people in the area, he realised, and even those he knew were on the unemployed database and more likely to be offenders already, since they were free to engage in crime instead of working, and fond of alcohol binges, which needed a lot of cash he knew only vaguely from seeing them outside the Human Welfare Office in the queues. He was rarely able to link a face with a name, since it was mostly the front desks that dealt with them, and a lot of them had the same look about them. Their faces were kept in the files, though, copied over from the photo identification they were required to have, issued at the office. So maybe he could take a closer interest at work, since he'd not as much to do these days with the unemployed not even having to turn up to prove they were looking for work. Breakfast was meagre the next morning, since his wife had presented something inedible that she called rice cakes, instead of the usual white bread toasted to go with his 2 morning medium-boiled eggs. When asked about the strange meal, he was informed that there was no bread to be had. It had been some weeks since they'd stocked up, but it was rather a shock to realise that the shortages he feared were starting to kick in, when they were so close to the finish line and everyone being protected from getting sick. If the supplies to shops were drying up, then there were many still ill and unvaccinated, and the whole economy could come to a standstill. More importantly, at the moment, his breakfast was coming to a standstill. "Well, how do you know there's a shortage?" he inquired, sneakily, since he'd guessed she'd had a visit to the local shop, instead of just stocking up adequately on items she knew would be staples they would be relying on. They said so in the shop. She didn't try to hide the visit. It occurred to him that he should perhaps visit the local shop to see what conditions prevailed and how the rules were being enforced. "I might go round there myself later to inquire about when they expect delivery. We can't be expected to do without bread." The rice cakes weren't something he'd wanted to try even once, so they would need bread for the morning. "They may have a delivery later in the day." After dinner and the news, he went out to the shop. He took his car, although it was visible just from the house. No point in wasting time. He passed someone in the street who was probably returning from there, hopefully without the last of the day's bread in their plastic shopping bag. He pulled up carefully, making sure his car wasn't too far out from the pavement after he got out, and paused a moment longer to compare the clean paintwork to the other cars, smiled slightly, and entered. The shopkeeper was behind the counter, behind a plastic screen, in a mask. All well there, but he needed assistance to find the bread and approached the counter. There was a woman at the counter making a purchase, so he had to wait on the allotted spot on the floor until she was finished. He looked around, not having been inside the shop on many occasions, and then perhaps it had been quite some time ago, since it looked unfamiliar on the inside. It had the usual grocery items he could see, looking down one of the three small aisles, but looked far less hygienic and modern than the supermarket. It could be a hotbed of infection for all he knew, if the owner was as slovenly as the shop appeared to be. And the customers, he thought, as he observed the back of the person talking to the shopkeeper, a dumpy little woman talking to a dumpy little man, from what he could make out against the shine from the evening sun hitting the plastic protective shield. Another customer was pausing in the door. Robert could see him reading a big sign to the right as you walked in that said, "Only 2 customers in the shop at any time," with a simplified picture of a face with a mask on it and a circle with a diagonal bar on it. There were 2 already, and the man, who was well equipped, having sourced a large see-through face shield from somewhere, as well as the mask and gloves required, backed out hesitantly, bumping into another customer behind him, who had also been about to enter. They should have set up a sign outside asking them to wait, with someone in role of warden, telling them when to enter, but it seemed to be a shabby operation. The small shop, with only 1 staff member in evidence. He sighed. The woman in front of him was in no hurry to leave, after paying for her groceries, and was chatting, while holding open the plastic bag for the man behind the counter to fill, both of them laughing about something or nothing. He moved up to within regulation distance of the counter when the woman finally gathered up her bag and folded her purse into her shabby coat's pocket and shuffled away and shouted to ensure being heard, "Where's the bread?" "It hasn't arrived today, Robert." How did this man know his name? Why was there still no bread? Why hasn't the delivery arrived? I had no breakfast this morning, you know. Is this how you treat your customers? He suspected that there had, in fact, been a late delivery, but the man was hoarding the bread that had arrived late for his first customers in the morning, probably his biggest spenders, to keep them happy and to hell with everyone else. A firm tone might produce some results. "I'm sorry, I rang them, but they said they'd have bread tomorrow. They said there was some problem with getting the factory up and running for the day because an inspector was in and insisted they had to sanitize all the machines. Something about it being a high-risk environment. They're everywhere. They even told us they'd been in for a spotted check surprise visit sometime soon." He looked bewildered, the man, or at least the eyes looked blank. It was hard to tell when people wore masks. He seemed to be sticking to the story that there was no bread, though, and it did seem a plausible explanation, so there was nothing to be done about it. The thought of having to go another morning with no bread, though, or worse, consider eating rice cakes with his eggs, was too much, and he turned into one of the aisles to see if there was anything vaguely palatable that could be substituted. Think, what could one have instead of bread in the morning? Yes, of course, cake. Ha ha, let them eat cake, somebody once said. He forgot who, but it was a good idea, and it would be a nice treat to buy a little cake. Perhaps one of those cinnamon ones you always got in the petrol station if caught on the hop while filling up and feeling a bit peckish. A bit of sugar is no harm, and a change as good as a rest, he told himself while scanning the shelves. The other customer in the fancy face shield had gained access to the shop as well, now that the mouthy customer had left, and he was waiting at the end of the short, narrow aisle for him to find whatever he was looking for and leave the aisle to get the right distance between them to proceed. It wasn't easy, he thought, with all these different packets of things which he didn't recognize, and they didn't have little labels underneath identifying what the various things were inside the packets. You had to pick things up and figure out what the picture was, and often it was covered by a big logo of the company that made it, with the picture of whatever it was very small. Near the end of that aisle there were cakes, which it took him longer to find because of the abysmal lack of signage other than the ones about having to wear a mask and how far apart to stand, and all that. But these all seemed to be afternoon type cakes that you had when it was a special occasion or someone you wanted to impress came round. They were big things with icing or chocolate filling and not something you would eat for breakfast. He struggled, wondering whether to examine the row of crackers he'd seen and try to find something better than the rice cakes his wife had bought among them, or take the drastic step of having the wrong sort of cake for breakfast and no eggs at all. It seemed not too much in the way of choice to have to make, but he decided perhaps crackers would be the thing, as he remembered a type he sometimes had at home at supper if he was peckish after a light dinner, with jam on it to tide him over until bedtime, and started back down the aisle. The shield-faced man was selecting things from a shelf there now, though, so he would have to wait his turn. He sighed again. What a trial a simple loaf of bread had created. Finally, he had some crackers that he knew were bland enough to pretend to himself that they were as good as bread to eat with the breakfast eggs. Deirdre should have thought of this and not be forcing rice cakes on a man that was about to head out for a day's work. After paying, made tricky by the fact that the shopkeeper said there was something wrong with the scanning payment machine, after several failed attempts, then announcing the power supply must have temporarily cut off. He found this unlikely, but the man met his eye and shrugged faintly, as if it were a normal occurrence. Rummaging in his suit pocket for enough change to pay with cash, he turned and left the shop with the brief "good night," hearing his name said again in answer. He must ask Deirdre how the man knew him. He hoped she wasn't gossiping about their personal lives with shopkeepers. He almost bumped into someone on the way out. It was the woman with the bundle of sticks he'd noticed earlier, he felt sure. He'd seen her clearly, without her mask on, and here she was again, still without it and trying to enter the shop. She'd slightly moved to let him out, but she was nearly up in his face, with no mask on. She still didn't have it on when she swept past him into the shop, as he jumped aside to keep space between them. He turned in disbelief and stood watching her head down an aisle, forgetting where he was, and remembered that the news was sure to be starting if he didn't hurry home, as it had popped into his mind as he paid his bill at the shop counter. He shoved the crackers into the blue plastic bag the shopkeeper slid through the opening in the bottom of the screen between them. Chapter 18. He had time to talk to Deirdre about the whole thing when he arrived home, because his phone showed another half an hour to go before the evening national news broadcast came on. He was a bit curious about who the odd woman was, breaking the rules so flagrantly, and thought Deirdre might know. He'd had not time to note the details of her appearance to describe her, having seen her twice in the same day, and up close the second time. He turned, too, to watch her enter the shop, to see if she would put her mask on, and he'd noted her clothing while he was watching her, to ask his wife about her. He described the incident in the shop and what she looked like. Average height for a female, average weight, with medium length blonde hair with some grey bits in it as well. She was wearing a green jacket of some sort, he remembered, and jeans. Deirdre didn't know who she was. He asked how the shopkeeper knew his name, which was the other thing he was curious about. She didn't seem to know that either, saying, "Maybe he saw you out and about, or passed you going into the house. He knows me by name." It was annoying not getting definite answers, but at least she knew about the face shields when he asked where the other customer has got his. "I think you can get them in a hardware shop. I've seen a few people wearing those, the ones that are really afraid of the virus like those." Well, we were all afraid, he thought, but it was nice not to be any more, as he remembered he had to dispose of the rubberized gloves and mask he'd worn, and wash his hands, since they were wet already, just from the few minutes spent around in the shop. He slipped the mask back into his pocket because it looked clean enough to get away with wearing again tomorrow at work. No point in wasting it, if he wasn't going to get sick now anyway. And it still looked clean enough and would dry out quickly, probably, if he hung it on the hook in the hall for reuse. Deirdre said that the principal had rung while he was out and said that online classes would be starting the next week. So as she settled down with headphones on to presumably finish whatever course she was doing, that would see her able to use whatever software they wanted her to use for during the classes. He sat down to the second evening news with a cup of tea in his hand. He didn't like all the changes constantly, but it was interesting to see how the government responded to the crisis and to note how well they were handling the whole business. The schools going online for a while was the big news nationally, and it was stressed that it would just be for a short time until all the vaccinations had been given to everyone in the country. The children would be the last to receive them, as they weren't as vulnerable, as they phrased it, to the virus, according to researchers, as old people. Although evidence was emerging that even the apparently healthy middle-aged demographic could catch it, with fatal consequences. It was what they called an opportunistic virus, looking for anyone to latch onto, but they hadn't had enough time to discover yet just where it originated or how it worked fully. They were focusing all their efforts on wiping it off the face of the earth as a joint effort globally, as their priority for the moment, as well as putting together the voluminous incoming data that was constantly updating about its movements around the globe and its spread, watching to see when it would start being less of a threat after all the new measures started taking effect to slow it down and give it nowhere to go. The cohort he was in was nearly done nationally, although many parts of the world, they said, weren't as lucky in working out deals to get enough injections for the populations, and the death rate was still rocketing upwards in those places. Even if the virus started going lower here, we'd all have to wait for the rest of the world to catch up before travel internationally would be possible again. Robert thought about their holidays, which they would normally be either planning or taking at this time of year, as Deirdre was usually on holidays for the summer from about now. Since the children had missed school for some weeks now, he couldn't remember exactly how long, they were making up the lost time with their new home teaching lessons for them. It wasn't clear yet how long this would be for, but it might just be the few weeks they had missed, and then they'd return to school when everyone got their injections. Older children took exams at certain times, he knew, and these used to be at the end of the school year. But of course, with small children, you didn't have that. And it might be good if they were kept inside on front of computers to study or show their coloured in things instead of being outside for the health of everyone else. There was a letter that arrived for him the next day, which spoiled that evening's news and confused him so much that he couldn't seem to get his understanding to engage with the meaning of it at all, although he read it many times after seeing it on the small hall's table, where Deirdre had got into the habit of putting the mail whenever she stepped outside for one of her walks, much shorter and less frequent these days with the travel rules in place, usually just to get something they had run out of, like milk or eggs at the corner shop. The letter had the Human Resource Office envelope, which he recognised at once, but the rest was mysterious, even after opening and reading it. The typed letter said, "Dear, we have made staff level changes in many of our human resource department section areas, including yours, and will not be requiring your services effective immediately in your area of our human welfare filing resources department. Due to the rigorous analysis we carried out to ensure our staff levels function at optimal levels in response to the current climate of crisis, where we must respond to the needs of the public and also seek to streamline the services we provide to implement maximal value to budget allowances while still providing the excellent existing range of services to all our clients, it has recently become necessary to make different staff arrangements, which make maximal use and give maximum value to our allotted quarterly budgets. We have examined these potential areas of budget allocation maximisation and concluded that we can see the economic value of trimming down staff levels at our offices. As part of the government team, we know you will see the economic rationale of these cost-saving steps. Kind regards, the Section Manager, Human Welfare Offices." The letter was signed in blue pen by his over-manager, and his own name had been filled in as well on the first line, in the same blue handwriting. He read it many times, glancing at it in the little hallway, meaning to examine it better in the spare room, but he stood for quite a while rereading it before making his way into the spare room off the hall to read it again, then again, trying to make sense of it. He found himself staring out at the back garden where Deirdre was pulling up weeds. Maybe she could understand it, or get him clearer on the meaning. The air might clear his head. He was feeling a bit unwell. "Deirdre," he approached her. She was bending over a pot, poking at something in it, not weeding, as he had thought. "They're doing okay, aren't they?" She looked up at him on hearing her name and shoved a colander at him with some pea pods in the bottom. "They weren't doing so well there for a while, but I think they dried out too much a few weeks ago. But I nursed them along. Just look at them now." She was peering into the colander. He supposed they would be in tonight's dinner. "The rest of them are nearly ready. Those ones," she said, pointing somewhere in the staked plants, "are still in flower, but there are as many there as I got today, nearly ready to be picked. Oh, I'd say by next weekend." She grinned foolishly at him, excited about a few vegetables. "Yes, Deirdre, I need you to look at something and tell me what you think it means." He didn't expect her to have much in the way of sensible input, but two heads, they do say, are better than one. And the language in it was a bit ambiguous. He waved the letter which he'd put back in the envelope at her, showing it, as she'd showed the peas, to get a reaction of some kind. Not here, though. Come inside and look at it, he added, since she was reaching a hand forward, expecting him to give it to her right there. Okay, Robert. Well, give me a minute to wash my hands and change my shoes. He looked down at her feet. She must have been walking about in the muck of the vegetable bed, and the hands, he'd noticed, were dirty too. See you in the living room then. Be quick, though, because I want to see the news, and we haven't eaten yet either. He took his phone out of his suit pocket to check the time and headed back into the house. She read the letter, with him examining her face as she did, for signs of comprehension. Would she be able to make sense of it where he'd failed to? She looked up after reading, with the hand holding the letter dropping to her lap. Oh, Robert, I'm sorry. She looked concerned, or surprised, or something, but he wasn't sure what her expression or words meant, just like he wasn't sure what the letter meant. Well, what does it mean, do you think? She still had the odd expression. Robert, they say they don't require your services. Don't you know what that means yourself? If I knew, I wouldn't be asking you, he pointed out very slowly and clearly, as she was throwing the question back at him after he had asked for her opinion on what the contents meant. She said after a pause, very quietly, looking at him with the same ridiculous expression, "It means you lost your job." Of course I haven't, he was shouting now. Nobody should have to put up with this level of stupidity. I'm an essential worker. He couldn't bear looking at her. He stood up, grabbed the letter, and retreated to where sanity still reigned, in the spare room, to calm down a bit, and reread the thing again to see if he could make sense of it. By dinner time, he felt he understood it better. Tomorrow morning he'd ring the office to see if he could clarify it, just to be sure. They wanted him to work from home, just while the rest of the nation was finished getting injections. Another few readings confirmed that was what they wanted him to do. All the different cohorts would be completed quickly, and he would be back in the office in no time. He just needed to know what files he was to access and work with, and who would be duplicating and filing the files in the cabinets so he could coordinate with them via email, etc. Simple. His overmanager, though no doubt very busy, would surely take a few moments to talk to him about the new arrangements, as the details of them hadn't been specified in the letter sent. He was probably going to be waiting for his call in the morning, and had it in his scheduled calendar already, eager to hear Robert's ideas about how to coordinate it, which admittedly he hadn't formulated in his own mind clearly yet. Chapter 19. He thought about it all through dinner, and even the news headlines didn't seem to sink in. But it was important to get a plan of action together and be on top of things before ringing the overmanager in the morning. He was terribly nervous about the prospect, as he didn't like being under pressure to find the right words when talking to the manager. The phone might be easier than in person, he reminded himself, as it was being watched as he was thinking of the right answers to give that usually put him off his game, so to speak. On the phone, he would have the manager's full attention for at least a few minutes or so, and there was bound to be a valuable interaction that might even be a bonding of colleagues, a rapport created by having to work out the details of the new arrangement of him temporarily working from home. He didn't sleep well, but was still working through all the permutations. So it wasn't time wasted by any means. It would be very difficult, he could see, to implement the same system without personal access to the filing cabinet at the Human Welfare Office. But he couldn't think of any way to get through his workday without access to it. The manager must have something in mind, but he couldn't guess what system he was thinking of to replace the old and didn't want to be taken by surprise with something possibly suggested that he couldn't grasp instantly. One didn't want to look stupid on front of the overmanager and needed to be able to nod when he was explaining the system, as if one had already guessed what it would entail from him personally in his workday at home. Certainly he had a good filing system and enough stationery to see him through if he was required to return to the office with paper files. He had plenty of forms at his disposal if they needed to see duplicates of what was done during the day on the spare room computer. He would have to refer to it as his office space now, so as not to slip up on the telephone if his manager needed to call him there from time to time. He'd make sure his overmanager had his phone number tomorrow and could set up his mobile cell phone on the little stand his wife had for hers so that it had all the office trappings required in the revised circumstances made necessary by the health crisis. He had to admit the Human Welfare Office were good at reacting quickly to changing circumstances, and it was lucky that he was a sharp enough employee to roll with the punches too. It would be just for a while, and maybe he would get used to it quickly. It was strange not going to the office the next morning, while knowing that other employees were making their way in the traffic, and he missed the morning commute, something that he didn't know he enjoyed until he felt the strangeness of sitting in the spare room, his office, waiting for the office to open, rather than sitting in his car in the car park or in a traffic jam. Deirdre was setting up her computer as well, with various notebooks and bits of things around it for her first day of home school, whatever, with children. He wasn't sure how she was going to go about it, but she said at breakfast she was very nervous and asked if he was about the phone call, which he told her he would be making this morning. He explained that it was just a matter of getting used to something new, and then left her to her own devices and went to the office where his were. The computer was on in case he needed to access files while talking to the manager, and he decided that making a list of all his duties, refiling and ordering supplies, would be a good use of his time waiting for office hours to start, and would make him feel more organised before his chat with the manager. He checked the time display at the bottom of the computer screen at regular intervals, since it had occurred to him that the overmanager might ring him first. He had his contact details on file after all, and would be keen to talk to him. At 10:35, after leaving the overmanager enough time to get settled in for the day, and time in case he wished to take the initiative first, he decided it was a good time to ring, but not too early, but not too late enough that he seemed not keen enough to take it, and picked up the small card he'd taken out of his wallet, which didn't have the overmanager's number, as he didn't know it, not being required to make calls to his office while in work, but did have the main switchboard number. They would put him through. It seemed to be busy. He would have to ring again. He rang several times with the same result, but after the 10th or so attempt, got through. A voice said, "Human Welfare Office, please hold." Then there was a click, and some kind of music began playing. A violin. He held the phone to his ear, switching it every so often, as his neck was playing up a bit. After 5 minutes or so, holding it with one hand, then resting his elbow on the desk as he checked over his notes with his right hand, then switching it to the other hand as his ear became hot and his arm slightly numb. He shook out his left hand to send the blood down the arm again, considering putting it on the small holder he had for that purpose. He was afraid he wouldn't react fast enough if the manager suddenly started speaking, though, so decided it wouldn't be a good idea. He must have been listening to the violin for 15 minutes or so, when that suddenly froze too. There was another click, and at first he thought he'd been put through to the over-manager. But as he repeated, "Hello? Hello?" several times over, with no response coming, he wondered whether there had been a fault in the line during the putting him through bit. Perhaps he should ring again. After several more attempts, he had more success. He was put on hold for quite a long time again, after the same busy lines at first, and there were number options you had to press to get through to the right person, to ask them to talk to someone else you needed. It was quicker the second time, despite the busy lines and being put on hold, because he knew now which number to choose, which he wasn't sure of at first. The employee dealing with them, probably, he thought, someone from the front desks, as they handled most of the external calls, did get him through to the manager this time, after he'd heard another part of the violin music, which didn't help him be in the sharp mood he required to speak about business, but couldn't be helped. The manager's voice was recognizable as he greeted him with the usual greeting, reserved whenever he'd asked any questions before. "What do you want, Robert?" It was not phrased as a question. Robert wondered whether the over-manager was pressed for time and asking him for his view on how to manage working from home. "Robert, I'm very busy, so if you could keep it brief." There it was, then, just as he had thought, probably doing a lot of tasks or between important meetings. "Well, I've been thinking about how to go about working from home, and I have a list of duties here if you'd like me to go through them. I mean, if that would be appropriate. Or," he added, not wanting to seem to be taking too much initiative, seeming disrespectful to the manager's superior role in the organization. "Or you could tell me how to proceed. I mean, what new tasks or, changes I need to make, because—" He was saying "I mean" far too much, he thought. He sometimes did that when he was feeling under pressure a little. "Don't get nervous, Robert. Try to make sense. Because," he went on, "I'm not near my filing cabinet, am I?" That didn't sound good, phrasing it as a question. Sounded uncertain. He cleared his throat slightly, as it was very dry. He should have thought to bring a glass of water into the office. "Robert, you should have received a letter from us. Did you receive it yet? We sent it on Friday. If it doesn't arrive today, you don't need to do anything until tomorrow. Then read it. We won't be requiring you. Now, if you're satisfied, I have things to do, unless I can answer any other questions." Well, no. Do nothing until tomorrow. Okay." He couldn't think straight, as the conversation was a bit different than he'd imagined. He added, as it came to him in a rush, "Do you want me to ring you tomorrow, then?" "No, Robert. We can send any papers from your file out to you. Probably later in the week or early next week. We're busy, as you know." The over-manager laughed, and it seemed the right thing to do, to share the little joke with him, so he laughed a little as well. "Goodbye, Robert, and good luck." "Yes, goodbye then, and thank you for your time." "It's nothing." Click. That was the signal of the end of the conversation, as the phone call had clearly terminated. He put the warm phone in the holder and sat a while. Clearly some more thinking was in order, to make sense of what had been said. He was to stay at home today and wait for another letter. But he had a letter already that must have gone out on Friday. Or perhaps the one he had went out on Thursday and was held up slightly, and there was another one to come with instructions about what his new role or slightly altered role was to entail and how to fulfill that role efficiently. A list of duties and requirements and how to carry them out, which made sense because really they were rewriting the manuals, what with the virus changing how everything worked. It probably hadn't been sent out until Friday because it was a complicated document that took a while to put together. Yes, that made perfect sense. He was to do nothing today because the instructions would arrive tomorrow. He started to feel a little more relaxed and realized he needed to use the bathroom urgently. He'd get a glass of water afterwards, perhaps even a cup of tea. His wife was talking to the computer, which was strange until he realized she must be talking to one of the children on her screen. He put the kettle on himself and waited for it to boil, wondering what he was supposed to do with the rest of the day. He supposed he could catch up with the news on his phone or the computer in the office, since the whole morning seemed to have disappeared almost already, and the headlines might be coming on the radio soon. He could listen to them in the office on the radio just as easily and look at some of the headlines in online daily newspapers as well, since he was free as a bird, as they say, for the day. Deirdre was still sitting at her computer at the table by the window when he emerged from his office at lunchtime. She was talking to it, and he went through the living room and into the kitchen to see what stage lunch was at. He hoped it would be something hot rather than the usual sandwiches she made for lunch, which he normally would pick up from the kitchen counter just before leaving for the office. A sandwich would be all right, though, as he quite liked cheese sandwiches. Sometimes there would be a biscuit-style chocolate bar as well to have for his afternoon break. But of course, they would hardly need to be packed into a bag with the sandwich as usual for him to collect if he was at home. He scanned the kitchen table, then the countertop. Nothing. Back in the living room, she was still talking, and he could see by leaning in sideways as he approached the table with the computer that it was a small child holding up some sort of scribbles on a piece of paper that she was talking to. Didn't she know it was nearly 12:30 and his lunch should be prepared? He returned to the office to check his phone for the exact time, then returned to the living room with it, holding it up to display the time, pointing at it, standing on the opposite side of the table, leaning over the computer. She looked up and down again, then up at him, still talking away to the child, who was babbling away about God knows what. The thing he'd drawn on the paper, he supposed. His lunch was more important than a child's babblings. Yes, John, well, I'm sure your little dog will love the picture of him. I'll talk to you again next week, and don't forget the little project you're going to do, or the poem about your granddad, and the 10 times tables you're going to say for me, and the multiplying sums, okay? Would she not stop for the love of? A man needs his lunch here. Finally, she said goodbye, with a ridiculous wave added, and clicked the computer mouse around on the tabletop. What was she doing now? Still not moving herself to get the lunch ready. It was too much. Sorry, I was running a bit late there. John wanted to show me his picture, and you know how they love to tell you all about it. She laughed, but was still fiddling about. I just have to get out of this screen. Took me ages to even get the sound working. I made a bit of a mess of it, but we got there. The kids were pretty patient with me. I couldn't do multiple screens for some reason, and I had to tell 2 of them I'd talk to Alison first so I could get back to them. I must figure that out the next time, because I'm supposed to do it in groups of 3. She'd finished talking and messing with the mouse at least. It must be nearly 22 by now. She looked up. How was your phone call? It was fine. Where's my lunch, Deirdre? I haven't made it yet. What would you like? What a stupid question. Well, a cheese sandwich, I suppose. It's getting very late, Deirdre. I just want my sandwich. She hadn't moved, but it finally dawned on her that she was leaving him waiting and he was hungry, and it was lunchtime. She stood saying, "Sorry about that," and headed to the kitchen.